Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture in Political Science 1 American Government and Institutions. Today we're going to begin Unit 1, Foundations of American Government. Essentially, what we're going to be discussing in this lecture is why we have government in the first place. Where is the origins of American political institutions? And once we figure that out, we're going to discuss essentially the purpose of government, why we have it, what is it. But before I do, it's important for us to talk a little bit about the discipline of political science. So with that, let's transition to the next slide. So political science falls within the social sciences, and if you don't know what the social sciences are, they are made up of other disciplines. For example, economics, history, philosophy, sociology, anthropology. All of these fields falls within the social sciences. They study human nature. They study human beings. They study the building up of societies. And political science falls under this umbrella. In fact, Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, in his perennial work called The Politics, talks about political science as the master discipline or the master of the social sciences. A lot of my colleagues will not like to hear that, but I would say, and again I'm biased here because I teach this subject, that it is, because you can't talk about politics without talking about economics or sociology or history or philosophy, so on and so forth. So it is, in a way, the master discipline. I like to use the analogy of the Lord of the Rings, right? It's the discipline that rules them all. Another thing about political science that you'll need to know is that it is based off of a normative study. Now, what is a normative study? As you can see on the PowerPoint, it asks the question, what ought to be? What ought to be the characteristics of the ideal government, right? What is the characteristics that make up the perfect government? You probably have heard of the word utopian. And if I were in class, I would ask you what this word meant, and a few of you may know what it means, but it is this idea of the perfect society, right? The word utopia, in fact, was coined by Sir Thomas More, the famous, in a way, philosopher and aristocrat who worked under Henry VIII in England and wrote the book entitled Utopia, where he describes the characteristics of the perfect society. In a very similar way, this field of political science called political theory or political philosophy essentially asks that same question, what ought to be. In this case, of course, we look at the subfield of government. Okay, so what you will see is that many of the political philosophers of the ages, including Plato, who talked about his mentor Socrates, and Aristotle, and were asked these same very questions. In fact, if you read the book The Republic by Plato, it talks about the perfect characteristics of the city-state or the polis in Greek ancient times in Athens. If you read the book The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, he in fact talks about again the perfect government, in this case how to rule without a moral compass. In fact, he wrote the book for a famous Italian family, the Medici family, specifically the head of the Medici family at the time, Lorenzo de' Medici, to try to get in good favors with him. Hobbes and Locke are the two English philosophers who we will talk about in this lecture in much greater detail. For the most part, set the foundations to the type of modern government that we have today. This idea of natural law theory, natural rights, the foundations really of our system of government comes from these two English philosophers. So the point is that what you'll see here is that the framers, and when I say the framers, I'm talking about the founding fathers, people like Washington and Madison and Adams and Jefferson and so on and so forth, were greatly influenced by these political philosophers that preceded them, and you will see how the ideas of these political philosophers ultimately grounded, again, our system of government. So in this first lecture, entitled Roots of American Politics and Government, we're going to look at the key ideas upon which the American political system is founded. It's essentially, again, the question of political philosophy, as I mentioned before in the previous slide. What ought to be the characteristics of the perfect government? And as such, the main question in this lecture is the origins of government. Where did it come from? So I want you just to think about, again, how the U.S. government is structured, and ask yourselves the theory that led to the formation of our government. In other words, what were the key ideas, really, that culminated to the creation of what we now base our system of government called the U.S. Constitution? So the goal of this lecture is to provide you that foundation, and also to try to provide for you some general ideas of the nature of politics and to define some terms. So here we go. So before I begin, for those of you who are linear thinkers, which I think most of us are, I am going to provide you a brief overview of where we're going, the roadmap of where we're going in this lecture. So here it is in a nutshell for you. I'm going to try to define for you the term political science and define for you what politics is. We're going to look again at the purpose of government. We're going to try to identify the different characteristics that make up democratic regimes versus non-democratic regimes, or authoritarian, or you may know, totalitarian systems of government. We'll then transition by looking at the political theories of both Hobbes and Locke, which I mentioned to you, again, grounds the characteristics of our own American political system. And we'll look at the heart of their theory that is based on this idea called the social contract, which is also known as natural law theory. And we're going to explore how, in a way, this is the theory that creates, again, the concept of government as we know it today. We're going to look at how social contract theory also influenced, very much so, the Declaration of Independence that allowed, again, the United States to break away from its mother country, England. And you'll see how very much social contract theory gives reason to why ultimately the framers ratified the Declaration. And last but not least, we'll come back to the nature of politics and look at the proper role. I know it's a very subjective term, but look at the proper role of American government today. So that's where we are going. Okay, so let's begin. What is political science? Well, pretty simple. Political science, hint hint, is the study of politics, okay? Which should beg the question, right? what is then is politics. Okay, politics, you guys, hint hint, is the process of determining who gets what, when, how, and where. This is, in a way, the definition that O'Connor, Sabato, and Yanis uses in your textbook, and I think it's a pretty good one, right? If you think about politics, and I'm going to go back to my example that politics is the master discipline. You can't talk about politics without talking about economics. Let me use the economics as an example to, in a way, elaborate this definition for you. For those of you who have had economics, there is a theory about resources and economics, and that theory is that resources are scarce, right? Scarcity. These resources ultimately are finite. In other words, for example, fossil fuels, if we continue to use them at this rate, ultimately it's going to disappear. I know we'll find technologies to find renewable energy, but again, fossil fuels, this idea is that this is a limited resource. And so if that is the case, that resources are scarce and that resources are limited, politics enters in then as to how we as a society, right, determines how we are going to allocate those limited sources, right? Politics slash government becomes the vehicle or the tool in itself as we as a society determine who gets those limited resources, what those limited sources are, when are they going to get them, how are they going to get them, where are they going to get them. And in a way, politics in this case, again, falls under resource allocation, right? We as a society prioritize how to allocate these limited resources. But please understand, and this is important for you to note, that it's not just limited resources that politics allocates. Politics also determines and allocates, in a way, rights, right? Certain groups of people have certain rights, and politics also determines that. And that's why it can get very, very controversial, why people get passionate about it, because politics also determines, again, who are the winners and who are the losers, which group of people have certain rights, which groups are denied certain rights. So as you can see, it becomes very, very controversial in that context. And again, we will elaborate on that further as we go through throughout the semester. As I've talked about already, politics is also a process, right? Politics is this process of getting and keeping power to influence decisions about who gets what, when, how, and where. And that's why in politics you cannot talk about politics without talking about this idea of power. Ultimately, you have to have power to make these decisions about who gets what, when, how, and where. And yes, there are procedures that the people in power make, rules that they make, that will determine, again, who gets rights and who gets resources. And in our American political system, it works via this idea, which we'll revisit here in a moment, this idea of majority rule. And in our system of government, we're going to look specifically at Congress. If you look at Congress today, there are political parties ultimately are the ones who have power to make these decisions. And if you look at Congress today, the political party that dominates both chambers in Congress, both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, is the Republican Party. Why do they have power? Because they are in the majority. Okay, so again, without having to go too in-depth at this point, just note that, right? That ultimately Congress wields its power by majority rule. So whichever political party has the majority, then they are the ones in power to determine politics, to determine who gets what, when, how, and where, and also to determine the process, the procedural rules that will, again, influence and make that allow them to influence and make the decisions about who gets what, when, how, and where. And the pictures below, by the way, are the two chambers. Chambers' leadership. You have Mitch McConnell there on the left-hand side with his Republican leadership in the Senate, and you have Speaker John Boehner there again with his Republican colleagues in the House. So let's talk about these three terms. Continuing on with understanding the nature of government and politics, you really can't talk about politics without understanding and really differentiating and understanding the nuance of these three terms. The terms are power, authority, and legitimacy. Hint, hint on all three. I will define them and give you examples to them. In the previous slide, I told you that you cannot talk about politics without talking about power. In a way, you'll find out that the study of political science as a field is really the study of power. How do you gain power? How do you limit power? How do you exercise power? And so in that case, let me now define for you these terms. When you actually perhaps look at these terms, it may to some of you think, well, they're all one and the same. They mean the same thing. In the field of political science, however, they're different, and you'll see this. So now here's the first definition. Power in the political context is the ability to get individuals, groups, or institutions to do something. Okay? It's the ability to get individuals, groups, or institutions to do something. Okay, that's power in the political context. For example, when interest groups grow so much that it forces decision makers, for example, government officials, to listen, we say, again, that group has power. The media, when it has the ability to sway public opinion from one candidate to another, we would say that that media outlet is powerful, right? So again, it is this ability to get individuals, groups, or institutions to do what you want them to do. That is power, okay? You'll find out if you come see me in comparative politics that there are different dimensions of power, but for now, that is the definition that we will work with, okay? The next term that I would like you to note is this idea called authority. Authority is defined as the recognized right of an individual, group, or institution to make decisions. Okay? I'm going to repeat that definition, but the key words in that definition is the terms recognized right. So authority is defined as the recognized right of an individual, group, or institution to make decisions. So let me give you an example. Congress. So where does Congress get its authority to speak on our behalf? While we may not think about this, while we may not agree with all of their decisions, members of Congress, we do recognize their authority to make decisions on our behalf. So the question then is to ask, where did they get that authority from? And the simple answer is that we elected them, right? We voted them in. We, in a way, put them in power, okay? And therefore gave them authority to give, to make, in a way, policies on our behalf, okay? And so that is authority. So here's one of the mathematical problems, simple mathematical problems or equations that you'll encounter in this class. But think of it this way: if you take power plus authority what you're going to equal is this idea called legitimacy. Okay? When an individual, group, or institution has both power and authority, we consider them legitimate. Okay? Well, for example, the president has the power to be the commander-in-chief of our military armed forces. He can determine the mission, and he is in fact over, again, the military, albeit he is a civilian. But he has the power to do so as listed down in the U.S. Constitution. But he also has authority because we, the people, of course, elected him. He has the mandate, right, to exercise this power, and therefore we consider the office of the presidency, which, by the way, is pictured right above the picture of the Oval Office. We consider that office as legitimate, right? The U.S. Supreme Court, which is pictured down below, to give you an example, may have the power to make certain decisions, interpret the rules, and adjudicate the laws. But some people may argue that they may not have the authority to speak on behalf of the American people, because some of you may know Supreme Court justices are not elected, but rather are appointed by the President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So some people may have this different interpretation that they do not have authority, and so this would question their legitimacy. In fact, another example, the opposite may be true as well, where the Supreme Court may have the authority, you could say, again, to interpret decisions and adjudicate the laws, but may not have the power to execute those laws. In fact, this was the case in the famous Brown versus the Board of Education decision back in 1954, that, as you know, integrated the schools and ended segregation. They, again, ruled in Brown that separate but equal was unconstitutional, but that ruling had major implications of integrating the school. So if you think about this, it wasn't the 9 Supreme Court justices who integrated the schools, but really the president did. Some of you folks may recall the picture of in your history books of the Little Rock Nine, where you had African American students again entering the colleges and universities in Arkansas, and the governor, the president in this case, President Eisenhower, actually had to bring in the National Guard to try to quell the crowds who were in opposition of integration, right? So again, just to put it in context to you, these terms are fluid. They are not black and white, and in fact, they're not black and white, but they are very, very important to our study of politics as we look at differing institutions to certain degrees, how much an institution has power, authority, and legitimacy. How much an institution has power and authority will determine its degree of legitimacy. I think it's always good to start off with a very straightforward definition, and so I've given you a definition here of what is government. So when you think of the word government, this is the characteristics that should come into mind to you. It is a formal organization, okay? So it has members, rules, procedures, so on and so forth. We just talked about power and authority in the previous slide. So government has power and authority, and again, if it has power and authority, okay, theoretically it will have legitimacy. And it has 3 functions. Okay, government, simplified, has 3 roles. And in fact, if anybody were to ask you what does government do, and if you give them this definition, you're pretty much right on. Government does 3 things. It makes laws, it enforces laws, and it interprets laws. Okay? And so what I have here for you, I would have drawn this up on the board and asked you to help me fill in the table here. But since you have it already in front of you, as you can see, on the rows I have the three branches of government, and on the columns I have the three government institutions that we have. So when again you think of government and you look at those roles, and there are three again major roles: to make laws, execute laws, and interpret laws. Here in the United States, they are broken up in different institutions, right? So if you look at the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces, executes, implements laws, and the judicial branch here interprets and adjudicates laws. So if you look at the United States, in our federal government, the branch that makes laws, of course, is the U.S. Congress. The branch that would then execute again those laws, implement and enforce those laws, would be the U.S. presidency and the federal bureaucracy. And the U.S. Supreme Court and the lower courts would make up the judicial branch, whose function it is to interpret and adjudicate those laws. And if you look at the state of California, California follows the exact same pattern, right? The branch that makes laws is the California State Legislature. The seat, of course, is in Sacramento. The executive branch in California is, of course, the governor. In this case, Governor Jerry Brown, currently. And the judicial branch are the state courts, but the highest court in the state would be the California State Supreme Court. Now, if you take a look at the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or in this case North Korea, the powers to make laws, execute laws, and interpret laws really belong to only one person. And as you can see up on the table, the person, of course, is the dictator Kim Jong-un. All right, so I want to jump the gun here, but I hopefully you'll notice something, that in democratic institutions, the powers to make laws, execute laws, and interpret laws are separate, right? And in authoritarian regimes, they are not separate. They only belong to the hands of one or a few people. In this case, in North Korea, it's Kim Jong-un. And so you may have noticed the word separate there. That is essentially it. If you look at democracies, the powers to make laws, execute laws, and interpret laws are separated. You probably have heard of the term separation of powers. That's essentially it right there. Okay, in democratic regimes, understand that these powers are separate, right? They are controlled by differing individuals, differing people in power, whereas in authoritarian regimes, again, we'll come back to this, they are typically held by one or a few people. All right, so continuing our discussion on the purpose and role of government, where does politics come into this, right? One of several definitions I'm going to give you is, again, this idea that politics is the process, right? And that politics occurs within government, or government in this case would be the institutions, right? So government and politics works together, right, about who gets what, when, how, and where. Okay, all right, so members of Congress in a way play politics, right, use the process to determine again resource allocation and rights. Now I want you to understand that there are different types of government institutions in differing societies. Since this is an American government and institutions class, of course we're focusing on our own government, but there are different types of government regimes out there. You probably have heard of communist regimes, socialist regimes, and so other nation states have different government institutions. Okay, and so that is in fact a topic of comparative politics, another class that I teach, which is Poli Sci 2. So our focus in this class, however, again, is American government. Um, Government and politics, these institutions also have power within specific geographic boundaries, right? This is uh, not to confuse you, but if you look at our system of government, we in fact do not just have one layer of government here in the United States. In fact, we have three layers. If I were in class, I would have drawn a triangle for you and divided that triangle into thirds. And the government on the top, of course, would be the U.S. government, the federal government that would have jurisdiction over ultimately anywhere, right? The U.S. controls territory. In the middle, you would have state government, and again, state government would have jurisdiction over its own territory as determined by the state boundaries. And then on the bottom you would have again local, city, county, or ward governments, and again the laws that they would pass or ordinances that they would pass would only have power over their jurisdiction. So good to know that there are different types of governments out there, but essentially that's an important component for you to understand, again, how politics and governments work. Okay, to provide more context to differentiate the difference between government and politics, I'm going to use a baseball analogy. We're in the middle of the pennant race here, the NL West, as you know. And really, you could use any other sport, but since we're in baseball season, the heart of baseball season now, let's just go ahead and look at baseball here. If you look at any sport, and look at baseball specifically, baseball, of course, has rules, and there's strategies. I'm going to give you the analogy now, and hopefully this will make sense here in a moment. Let's take one of the rules in baseball. The pitcher, right, must keep his or her foot on the mound as he releases, again, the pitch, the pitch. And if not, as we know, that is a violation of the rule. And so if that is the rule of the game, let me ask you what then is the strategy. We know in the rules the pitcher is attempting to strike out the batter, attempting to get an out. That's also stipulated, of course, in the rule book. But I want you guys to think about what's not written. Okay? And if you give this some thought, what's not written down is in fact how the pitcher throws the ball. Right? Does the pitcher throw a curveball? Does the pitcher throws a cutter, a fastball, a breaking ball, a slider, right? A changeup? Those are not written in the rule book. And so as such, what's not written down becomes the strategy of advantage. Okay? And what you'll see here is that in government, the rules of the game are made up of the government institutions. The strategy is the politics behind it. Okay? Let's stick with another example here in baseball. Now let's look at it from the other side of the battery and look at the hitter. Okay? The hitter, okay, in the rule book stipulates must remain inside the batter's box, right? When the pitch, of course, is delivered. That's in the rule book. Okay? How then does the hitter get the advantage? Well, there's a lot of things, right? When you're thinking about his advantage, remember, think about what's not written in the rule book. Some of the answers are perhaps the hitter can decide to pull the ball, right, and go opposite field, can decide to bunt to try to get on base. That would be, again, a strategy. The hitter can move all the way back to the batter's box, right? What would be the advantage of that? Well, that will give the hitter a split-second advantage, right, to see where the pitch is breaking, so he can identify the curve of the pitch, so he or she will know what to do with the ball. Okay, as you can see, that would become the strategy. Here's one last example here with a baseball analogy. Baseball, it stipulates in the rule book that you should have 3 outfielders, right? Left, center, right, outfielders. And if that is the rule, what is the strategy? Well, it depends, right? Depends on who the hitter is. The strategy may be to shift, right, the outfield or even the infield, right, to get a higher percentage of getting an out. I know growing up watching Barry Bonds play for the Giants, there was a huge shift whenever he got on the plate. So again, if you think about the strategy of advantage, think of the manager in baseball or any coach, right? The coach or the manager, they are the ones who sets up the strategy. In other words, how do you use the rules, right, to your advantage is essentially what politics is. Okay? So if you look at government now and politics, if government is made up of the rules, for example, one of the rules of government is that the House of Representatives, I apologize, yes, that's actually correct, the House of Representatives chooses its leader, the Speaker of the House, and the other offices. And that's stipulated in Article 1, Section 2. There's also the presidential veto, or the ability of the president to reject the bill, stipulated in Article 1, Section 7. Now, if you think about this document, where are the rules written down for government here in the United States? Some of you may already know this, but it's written down in the U.S. Constitution. There it is. So I want you to understand that the U.S. Constitution, if you think about it, is just a bunch of rules. Don't get intimidated by this document that we're going to study. Think of it as the rule book, which it really is. It's the rule book. How does government determine politics? Who gets what, when, where, why, and how? Okay, it outlines the procedures of politics, right? Politics is a process. Okay. Another, again, term of politics, as I described to you here, is that it's the strategy. How do you use the rules to advantage your side or your political party? Okay. So take a look at the first one. If the rule here is that the House chooses the Speaker and other offices, that is the rule. Well, how can you exercise politics? Okay, how can you use that rule to your advantage? Well, as I've explained to you before, you need to get the majority. You need to win the majority of the seats in that specific chamber of Congress, and whoever has the majority will use its power to elect the Speaker. Okay, and typically it's the majority party, right? No doubt. Okay. The Republicans today have the majority, so they're going to select one of their own to be the Speaker of the House, in this case, John Boehner. And John Boehner will then have the power, right, to appoint people in these committee chairmanships. And of course, he's not going to choose Democrats to assume those seats. He's going to choose his friends, his buddies, his fellow colleagues, his fellow Republicans. Okay, so as such, who controls the legislative agenda? Who's going to determine who gets what, when, where, why, and how? But the Republicans. Okay, let me move on to the next example: presidential veto. Okay, well, how can the president, again, if that is the rule, he has the ability to reject the bill. How can the president here use that to his advantage? Well, if you think about it, he doesn't even have to use it to get what he wants. Okay, all he has to do is to threaten to veto the bill that's going through Congress, right? If the bill, right, is going through the legislative process, the lawmaking process, the president doesn't like how how it's being created or what's in the bill. He can essentially signal Congress and tell them, Congress, if that bill looks exactly the way it looks right now and it gets to my desk, I'm going to veto it. That, in a way, is exercising power, because by letting Congress know that he's going to veto it, again, Congress is more apt to do what with a bill? Well, that's right, change it, right, to accommodate again, the desires of the president. So if you think about the term power, is that powerful? Absolutely. Remember the definition of power. It's to get individuals, groups, or institutions to get them to do what you want them to do. And by threatening Congress, threatening Congress by vetoing the bill, the president here is influencing the legislative process. Do you see how it all ties in and connects? Okay, so I'm going to now describe to you the political process. And this is very important for you to understand, because if you can frame this entire class using ultimately these criteria that I will outline for you, you will see how again, politics here works. Now, this was a former MyPoliSci simulation. Your recent text and Pearson decided to remove it for some reason. I loved it. This was supposed to be MyPoliSci number 1, but again, since it is not available for your edition for the text, you will not be doing this particular simulation. You will do a different one. But since it's so good, I am going to go ahead and explain to you how the simulation played out in order for me to explain to you the political process. So you should make a note of this chart. Make sure you, again, hopefully as you're listening to this, are also taking really, really good notes as we go through this lecture. So let me describe to you again the criteria to the political process. The first thing that I want you to focus on is that the political process always starts off with a problem. Okay? What is the problem? And if you were to have done the simulation would have indicated that the problem in this political scenario was what to do with the old town hall. This particular city, again, fictitious city, had a run-down old town hall. They didn't want to tear it down, so it was an opportunity to use the building for some other purpose. And so the question was what to do with this old town hall. The second criteria that you need to examine is to identify who the players or the stakeholders are in those folks who are involved with the problem. So in the simulation, you would have played the role of the mayor. Now, there were also senior citizens who had an interest in what to do with the old town hall. MAD stands for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and you also had union workers as well who had an interest. Speaking of interests, that is the third thing that you should identify when identifying the political process. Okay, what are the interests? Well, you as a mayor, your interest in this entire political problem here is to keep everyone happy. Why? You keep everyone happy. Your end goal, of course, is to be re-elected and to remain in power. Okay. Seniors, on the other hand, what do they want? Well, they want to play bingo, right? So they want a senior center to transform that old town hall into a senior center. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving group are requesting a teen center, right, to have their kids hang out after school and not get into trouble. And lastly, the union workers want a union hall. And as you can see, there are many differing stakeholders who have an interest in what to do with the old town hall. What typically happens at this point in the political process is number 4, there's going to be disagreement. There's going to be conflict. And I want you to understand, everybody, that in politics, this is inherent in the political process. You cannot avoid conflict. In fact, like I said, it is natural to the political process. It's going to happen. People are going to disagree. People are going to be passionate about it. Okay? And so in order for the political process to work at the end of the day, you must reach number 5. It must come to compromise. Unfortunately today, in our world where there is hyperpartisanship and people are so passionate about politics, there is this divide that sometimes people oftentimes look at the word compromise as a negative term. I would argue, again, as a person who teaches this class, that ultimately the political process involves compromise. Okay, not everyone's going to get everything that they want from the process. Although, in this particular simulation, this simplistic simulation that we're looking at, you'll find out everyone did get what they want. Okay, look at compromise number 1. Here's a very simple way, to make everyone happy. You can accommodate all of the interests by taking the old town hall, separating into 3 areas, and giving the seniors what they want, MAD what they want, and the union workers what they want. Okay, there was another compromise where the town hall would house the senior center and the union hall, and that the teen center was built by the help of the local Boys and Girls Club. Now it all depends on how you play the scenario, the simulation, and so that's the reason why it's really good. I might as well make mention of this. In fact, if you played the simulation in this particular way, the seniors, in fact, won. The city council voted to give control of the old town hall to the seniors, and that made the seniors very happy. That made the union workers unhappy, and just made the mad people even madder, right? And if you continued to play, the union folks wanted to recall you, or essentially remove you from office. So enjoy again doing the simulations, because it does put you in the first person point of view. Those My Poli Sci labs are actually quite fun to do. So going back to essentially what we talked about here with the political process, for you to identify the problem, the stakeholders, the players, what their interests are, understand that everything again leads to disagreement and conflict, and ultimately in order for it to work it must lead to compromise. I want you to understand that politics doesn't just occur again in government. Okay, when we examine individuals, public officials, organizations, different interest groups, there'll always be politics. There's also non-governmental politics, workplace politics, family politics, right? Okay. Let me give you a good example here in terms of workplace politics, and this would have been fun to do with you in class. I would have asked you if you had ever experienced negotiating a raise with your boss, in which again some of you may have had, and I want to use that example and put it here and use the context that I've outlined here for you for the political process. So given that scenario, let me ask you the problem. What's the problem? Well, the problem is you want a raise, and of course your boss in this case doesn't want to give you a raise. Who are the players? You and your boss. What are your interests? I just mentioned it. You want a raise, your boss does not want to give you a raise. And then you will enter into negotiation, which is essentially a nice way of a nice term that describes that you're entering into some form of conflict. And of course, you're going to have to negotiate and show evidence that you deserve the raise, that you make more widgets in an hour and deserve more money, and hopefully you come up with a compromise. So here's the life lesson I want to pass to you for those of you who have not engaged in this process, which I feel you will in the future. In the political process, if you're asking for a raise, make sure you ask more for what you want, right? For example, if you want a $10 raise, make sure you're asking for 20. Okay? Why is that? Because ultimately you and your boss, through the negotiation process, ultimately you're going to go down. You're going to have to meet in the middle. Okay? So again, make sure that you ask for more than what you actually desire. Don't ask if you want 10, okay? If you want $10, don't ask for $10 because ultimately you're going to get $5, right? Again, let your class pay off for you, right? And again, I'll be sharing with you more um, uh, life lessons, I guess, life strategies here for you to be successful in life. So, with that said, here's another example here of family politics. Okay, you want the car, right? What's the problem? You want the car. Who's the stakeholders? You and your mom. Okay, what are your interests? You want the car. Your mom's like, she doesn't want to give you the car. Okay, what's the compromise? You buy your own car, or at least that's what your mom would probably say. So as you can see, there are many things in life that again is political, whether it be in the workplace or whether it be in family situations. Um, it's part of the political process. Okay, so today the key players in American politics are the two major political parties: Republicans versus Democrats, Congress versus the president. Right? When you watch the news, it's really all about conflict. Really, there's no agreement about the what's. Okay, what's important to Congress may not necessarily be as important to the president. No, what's important to Republicans may not be as important to Democrats. Okay, so in this class, we're going to examine why these conflicts arise, which again is inherent in politics. Okay, we'll also look at the when. When the Civil War ended, did African Americans receive all of their political rights? No. Okay, we know that through history, so we'll examine why that was the case. Okay, and again, it wasn't until the 15th Amendment was ratified that gave, again, blacks the right to vote. Not until 1965, with the Equal Voting Rights Act, that that African Americans really received the same political rights. So, as students of political science, we're going to be asking how these things came about, and really, this is the reason why we study the subject of political science within the context of American politics. Okay, now let's look briefly at the types of government. And in this slide, I want to differentiate the difference here between non-democratic versus democratic regimes. Okay, so how do you know when regimes are non-democratic? Well, hint, hint. I think it's important for you to note that in this case, in non-democratic slash authoritarian slash totalitarian regimes, broad power is broad and absolute, right? In other words, only one or a few people have authority. Okay, that is a major characteristic of non-democratic regimes. I showed you in that table that the power is to make laws, execute laws, and interpret and adjudicate laws all fall in the hands of one or a few people. Those functions of government are held by one or a few. Major characteristics of authoritarian governments. Whereas if you contrast that with democratic governments, the authority of government is in fact limited. Okay? In democratic governments, power is limited. Okay, how is it limited? It's limited by the U.S. Constitution. And if you think about the U.S. Constitution, which I define for you as just a bunch of rules, and if you think about what rules do, rules limit what you can and cannot do, right? Don't they? Okay, rules in a way stipulates what people in power can and cannot do. So again, an important characteristic of democratic systems of government is that power is limited. Unlike authoritarian non-democratic regimes where dictators can virtually do whatever they want to do. There are no limitations to their power. Okay? So in democratic regimes, not only is government's authority limited, but many people have authority. Okay? As I said, differing institutions, the different branches of government are made up of quite a few people who share who share power. Okay, so these three characteristics of democratic regimes are very important for you to note. Hint, hint on all of them. Good multiple choice section for the exam. In democratic regimes, you guys are going to see really this idea of popular sovereignty. So what is popular sovereignty? Popular means the people. Sovereignty basically means they are free. Okay, the people, here's the formal definition, the people are able to create their own government. Okay, that is again popular sovereignty. Okay, that the people have the right to not only make their own government, but the right to rule and govern themselves. Okay, that is this idea of popular sovereignty. And again, you won't see popular sovereignty in non-democratic regimes, right? Power does not lie with the people, but rather in the hands of a few. The second characteristic that you'll see in democratic regimes is this idea called popular consent. It's essentially this idea that we have the right to agree and create a government along with its powers, right? That may be a little confusing. Let me clarify that for you. If under popular sovereignty we can create our own government and rule ourselves, in order for that system of government to have legitimacy, right, we must give consent, right? Another word for consent, permission, right? We give permission that that government can rule over us, right? That idea of popular consent was developed by the French political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It is essentially this idea, right, where we the people transfer our power to that system of government to rule over us. And in democratic governments, it's usually done through elections, right? Popular consent. Again, you'll find out that that will be the basis of, again, social contract theory that we'll talk much more about in a moment. Okay, and last but not least, again, democratic regimes operate by majority rule. In order for you to have power to determine who gets what, when, where, why, and how to exercise politics, you must have majority rule, 50% plus 1. Okay, so there it is. Alright, shifting our attention here to democratic government, there are two types of democratic governments I want you to know. Direct democracy and indirect democracy. Hint, hint on both of these. In fact, you'll find out that we here in California actually have both. Okay, so what is direct democracy? Here's a simple definition. It's where we the people make and vote for the policies ourselves. Okay, let me repeat that. When we the people make and vote for the policies ourselves. In fact, this idea of direct democracy stemmed from ancient Greece, specifically in the city-state of Athens, known as Athenian democracy. According to historians, this was really the birth, right, of democracy was in Athens. In fact, the word democracy is Greek, right? Demos is defined as the people, kratien, to rule, right? Democracy, the people rule. Back in ancient Athens, however, the people who could rule were also limited. There's only limited as to who had political rights, and that was, of course, every male Athenian citizen had political rights. But it was a form of direct democracy because they would, again, gather in the agora or the marketplace where they would cast their votes and make, again, policies themselves. Okay, interesting thing about Athenian democracy, which is different from our democracy, is that there were no elections. Okay, so how did they determine who would govern them or who would rule them, who would have power? Everything was done by lottery, if you think about it, right? All of us, for example, if I were to take our class, have you guys write your name in a piece of paper, put it in a hat, and then I would draw that name, and whoever that person is becomes the leader of the group. Everyone is equally qualified to be the leader of that city-state, as was the case of Pericles, who ruled Athens in its golden age, right? So again, that's a good example of how people directly make policies themselves, and things have changed here because we also vote. In California, we have direct democracy. You probably have heard of propositions before. Propositions, in fact, come about through the people. Okay, someone in California had an idea. Some controversial ones that we've had, of course, were Proposition 8 that um, changed the California Constitution to recognize marriage only between a man and a woman. That was a Proposition 30 during the recession that we'll talk about, that raised taxes on the wealthy to fund public higher education for a period of time. That's also a proposition that came out from someone in the state of California who put it on the ballot. And you probably again heard of propositions. Once these ideas are out, it goes through the Attorney General's office, whereupon the authors of the proposition are going to be tasked to get signatures to get it on the ballot. This is the reason why you're harassed outside of Safeway or Walmart or anywhere you shop, being asked for your signatures, because they're going to need to get X numbers of signatures by a certain period of time. More on this in Unit 3, but once they do, it then goes to the people. Okay, it becomes a ballot initiative for the people to actually vote on, and we get to vote on it. That's why my definition of direct democracy is as follows, right? It's when we, the people, make and vote for the policies ourselves. So indirect democracy in a way, is different from direct democracy, and in a way this is what you should be more familiar with, but it's when we, the people, would then vote for and elect representatives, and these representatives would then make policies on our behalf. Okay? That's an indirect democracy, and here in California we have indirect democracy as well, where we would vote for our representatives either in Congress or in state government, and they are responsible again for making policies on our behalf. Another term for indirect democracy is a representative system of government. This is also known as a republic. So why is it in political science we have these differing terms that mean the exact same thing? Because we want to confuse you. No, I'm just being sarcastic. It's because the term has evolved over time. Republic was used back in ancient days, in Greek and Roman days, Greco-Roman days, to describe choosing the most wise of them to rule. Representative system of government came about during the time of the American Revolutionary War. And indirect democracy is a term that we use today that allows us to differentiate the system between direct and indirect democracy. All right, we're going to transition now here from concepts to history. I love this part of this lecture. Why? Because we're going to go through about, I would say, 500 years of history in about 15 minutes. So I get criticized or poked fun of by my fellow history colleagues that we go through a lot of history in this short period. But it's going to be very, very important. So sit back, relax. I'm going to tell you a little story of how, again, our system of government came to be. So the question in this slide is, what are the ideas at the root of our American democratic government? I want to take us back in time here to the era of the divine rights of kings. Now, prior to 1776, okay, we're going to stay in Western Europe here. You look at Western Europe at the time prior to 1776. Again, 1776 is an important date because it's the birth date, of course, of our nation. But prior to 1776, most nations, of course, were ruled by kings and queens. And where did they get their authority from? Well, they got their authority from divine right, okay, by God, right? So Who's the spokesperson of God here on earth? At that time, there was only one church that dominated Western Europe, and of course that was the Universal Church, the Roman Catholic Church. So it's no surprise that the Pope, the papacy, or the bishop would be the one to crown the king or the queen, right? Put the crown on top of their head, symbolizing, right, their divine right to rule their peoples. Okay, funny story about Napoleon Bonaparte when he conquered much of Europe, and he of course decided to make himself an emperor, and during the coronation, the story goes, he waited impatiently for this old frail bishop to climb up the stairs to get to him. He got so impatient he ran down the stairs, grabbed the crown, really like pulled it away from the bishop, ran back to his throne and put the crown on top of his head. Yeah, I would like to say that Napoleon was a little prick. Absolutely, right? I mean, symbolically here, by him putting the crown on top of his head, he, in a way, didn't recognize the authority of God, that really his authority to rule came from himself. I like sharing that story because I think it's quite funny and quite telling about, again, Napoleon and his rule, which, again, didn't last for too long. So with that said, I am now going to talk about how ultimately we got from the rule of kings and queens to the modern government, democratic government that we have today. Okay, so I want you to follow where I'm going here. How in the world did we get from point A, the rule of the divine rights of kings, the rule of kings and queens based from God, to the modern system of government that we have today that's based on democratic principles, popular sovereignty, popular consent, majority rule. Okay? Well, there are two events that I want to highlight here for you, starting off with the Protestant Reformation, hint, hint, between the 1500s and 1600s. I'm going to just give you the abbreviated story of this. Some of you may have heard of the famous monk Martin Luther. Again, at the time, everyone belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther attended seminary, and at that point, Martin Luther, as he started learning about the church, started questioning the fundamental precepts that the church had. And in fact, he started to doubt the church's authority and therefore questioned its legitimacy. He eventually published a list of all of the problems that he had with the church. Okay, he had about 101 problems with the church. Okay, one of which was this idea called indulgencies. If you took Western Civ, you may know what an indulgency is. An indulgency was essentially a small piece of parchment paper that had the seal of the Pope, and in this parchment paper it basically said that your sins would be forgiven thee, right? It would be absolved, but you had to pay for it. Okay, and in a way this was a tactic that the church used in order to replenish its coffers. Pope Leo X, who was part of the Medici family, ironically enough, was a riotous individual, had concubines, spent lavishly, and ultimately replenished the coffers by using these indulgencies. And yes, it was very corrupt, and again, I'm not, please understand, I'm not undermining the Catholic Church. I think the Church's history here has a colored past, and I think most churches do as well. And at this time, the church was very, very corrupt. So not only could you buy these indulgencies for yourselves to forgive, to allow, again, God to forgive your sins, it really is, if you think about it, a pass to heaven, right? You could also buy it for your dead ancestors, right? Just really, I am just thinking about that. I'm sure it made, a grandma and grandpa who were deceased, roll in their graves, but you could in fact do that. You could buy it for them, and it would be in a way their gateway to heaven. Another problem that Martin Luther had with the church was this idea that you needed a priest in order for you to directly communicate with God. It was his belief that you could, again, talk directly to God by saying your own prayers, and many other problems, criticisms that he had with the Catholic Church. Like I said, he wrote them down, and interestingly enough, when he did write down all of his criticisms of the church, it was also at the time when the Gutenberg press was invented, so he had the opportunity to mass produce again all of his criticisms of the church, and it was printed on a mass scale, and it was nailed to every door of every hamlet, of every village, of every town, to every city, and it spread like wildfire, ultimately creating a rift between the followers of Martin Luther and the Roman Catholic Church that sparked, of course, as we know today, the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so why is this important? Okay, why is this important to our story? Remember where I'm leading you, right? How did we get from the divine rights of kings to our modern day democratic system of government? Well, this was Martin Luther's part. Follow me here, right? If you recall the divine rights of kings, I mentioned to you before that the king's authority came directly from the church. Okay, follow the logic. Once Martin Luther, criticized and questioned the authority of the church, that not only undermined the legitimacy of the church, but that also undermined the legitimacy of the kings and queens. Okay, so you see here a little bit of the crumbling, if you will, of the foundation of the rule of kings and queens because of Martin Luther, and ultimately all of the other sects, right, that would form because of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, another event that I want to highlight is the idea of the Enlightenment. Okay, we tend to neglect the importance of the Enlightenment because its very ideals are ingrained in us today. In fact, we don't question it anymore. This idea of individuality, this idea that we can rule ourselves and govern ourselves and be our own individual, stemmed from the Enlightenment. So what was the Enlightenment, right? It stemmed from the age of scientific reason, right? The age of reason and science. Think of Copernicus, Galileo. The ideas of systematic testing, the scientific method, why things work the way they are, were all developed during this period of time, and it really culminated to this idea one philosopher by the name of Descartes, right, with his Cogito ergo sum, which is translated in Latin this idea of I think, therefore I am, right? So how is this relevant to our story? I want you to understand that during the divine rights of kings, okay, we were all subject to the king, right? We couldn't own property. The king owned the property. If the king wanted to take our property, in fact, it wasn't really ours. If the king demanded his property back, we have to succumb to him. If the king wanted to take our lives, he could take it. So the Enlightenment was the first time where, again, this idea that we can govern our own selves, that we can make our own paths, follow our own stars, question for the first time the authority of the king. Why do I have to listen to the king, the bastard? I can make, again, my own destiny came to be. People started to recognize, again, the social effects of how people related to each other and how they would relate to themselves. It, again, started here to delegitimize the kings and the divine right of their authority and their legitimacy. So that's the Enlightenment. You have to understand that again. This concept of I and me, uh, and which is again so ingrained in our society, did not exist during the divine rights of kings, and that the Enlightenment thinkers at the time were the ones who provided us this idea. Once again, as you can see, the institutions that were in power, okay, the church, kings and queens, all of this, these events started to undermine their power and legitimacy. We'll come back there in a moment. But I want to just talk briefly about Henry VIII here, and how he played a part, again, of undermining the church's power. If you recall, Henry VIII had 6 wives, and he decided to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, which is part of modern-day Spain, because he wanted to hook up with his mistress, Anne Boleyn, who, by the way, gave birth to Elizabeth I, the great Queen of England, who was also Shakespeare's Elizabeth, if you know, again, a little bit of your English history. But remember, at the time, everyone was a member of the Catholic Church, so the Catholic Church did not recognize divorce. So what Henry did was he sent an emissary to Rome, whereupon the Pope told him that he could not get a divorce. And because of that, Henry decided to separate, right, from the Catholic Church and establish his own church called the Anglican Church, right, or the Church of England. So if you think of the modern day monarchs of England, Queen Elizabeth II and others, they don't just only have secular authority, but they also have spiritual authority as being the head of the Anglican Church. And as you can see, this once again undermined the role of the church, undermining its rule on kings and queens. So with that said, again, here, going back to the question of how in the world did we get from the divine rights of kings to democratic systems of government, this is where ultimately there is a power vacuum, right? The power institutions at the time, as I said, kings and queens and the church lost their power. So ultimately, once their powers were legitimized, there's a power vacuum that must be replaced there. And the question was who was going to replace that power vacuum now that the church was delegitimized, now that kings and queens were delegitimized. And as such, enter in these 2 English philosophers by the name of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and their ideas called social contract theory. And Hobbes and Locke played a crucial role here, because they really asked that same question as I posed to you: who would replace that power vacuum? And through their political theories, their political philosophies, the stories that they're going to tell, ultimately filled in that vacuum with, again, the government that we now know today, that is really built upon, again, democratic principles. Okay, so with that said, let's talk a little bit about Hobbes and Locke. Hint, hint, hint. They're going to be very, very important to our story. So I want to start us off with this concept or idea of the state of nature. Hint, hint, hint. Okay? I want you guys to understand that Hobbes and Locke did not necessarily live at the same time period. In fact, Hobbes lived first, and then Locke came shortly after him. And again, Locke really built on his theory based off of Hobbes. But we talked to them together because they're the ones who really solidified for us this idea called, hint, 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 the state of nature. So I want you to understand that when they are talking about their political philosophy, their political theories, what they're really doing is telling a story about us. Okay? And so I want you to understand that this place, when they start to tell their story, they have to start from somewhere, right? And the place that they begin their story is this fictitious theoretical place called the state of nature. So please understand that it is not real. and that this place had the following characteristics. Okay, um, this place called the state of nature has no government, right? No rules, no regulations, okay, no authority. In this place, everyone had individual freedom to do whatever they want, and everyone theoretically here was equal. No one was above or below um, anyone else. So I want you guys just to perhaps pause the video here for a moment and just jot down, and I take this seriously. I would really want you to think about this. Take about 2 or 3 minutes. Just stop and think about what you think life would be in the state of nature. Okay, and jot down a few ideas. Pause this video, and then once you have pondered this question, we'll start up again. So take the time to do that now. Okay, hopefully you took the time to pause the video, and depends on what you think. We would have had a really good, I think, class discussion on this. This is a thought-provoking question. Most students actually would say, and you may have written this down in your notes, that the state of nature would be a place of anarchy, right? Everyone would kill each other since there's no rules, no regulations. People are going to do whatever they want. You probably may have read the book The Lord of the Flies, right? It may be that this is what you may have thought of what the state of nature would look like. And I would say, yeah, for those of you who believed that the state of nature would be a place of anarchy and of death, you have in fact taken Hobbes's point of view of the state of nature. Okay, Hobbes's point of view of the state of nature is that, we'll come back to this, but I'll put a hint on it now. He believes that the state of nature is a state of war. Okay, that people will kill each other. There is no moral compass. There is no morality to guide human behavior. To Hobbes, the state of nature, and some of you may have written this down, would be a place that Darwin may have conceived of, right? This idea of social Darwinism, right? This idea that this place is a place to survive, right? The survival of the fittest. And the name of the game is survival, and you would do everything that you can in order for you to survive. Some of you, in fact, I would bet that a few of you may in fact think that the state of nature is a place that we wouldn't even kill each other. Okay? Because you may think that you may have a more optimistic view of human nature, and that people are naturally good, and so therefore they are not going to kill each other. If you believe that, then you would have taken Locke's point of view. And in fact, I've already given you the answer of, in essence here, of how to think about this question. The question really is, it depends. And it depends on your idea, as I said, of human nature. Okay? Locke, again, as I said, had a more optimistic view, which he calls natural law. In other words, here, which I'll talk much more about in more depth here in the next few slides, Locke believed that we are endowed with some form of moral consciousness, moral compass, that we know the difference between right and wrong, and as such, in the state of nature, we would not kill each other. For Hobbes, on the other hand, he had a more pessimistic view about human nature, right? I mean, to him, we cannot be trusted. We don't have a moral compass, that we would lie and cheat and do anything that we can here to survive. So I want you to ask yourself, really, and this is still a great debate that continues on even until today, what is man's state, right? What's really at our core? Are we in fact selfish, evil, or mean, as Hobbes would propose, or are we in fact altruistic or good? which Locke would again offer up. Okay, so really ponder that, because ultimately what you'll see is that their political theory will hinge upon that very idea on human nature. Okay, and remember, they're only they're talking, they're telling stories about us, about who we are. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to leave Hobbes and Locke here just for this particular slide, um, and talk a little bit about the state of nature further. Hobbes and Locke, as I mentioned to you before, created this idea of the state of nature, and I told you it was a fictitious place because Hobbes and Locke knew that in order for them to continue their story about us, we could not stay in the state of nature, right? In a way, the state of nature cannot really exist, right? If you think about the state of nature, um, can everyone maintain equality? Can everyone maintain freedom? No, absolutely not, right? Okay, if you believe in Hobbes that we're going to kill each other, ultimately someone's going to find a weapon and kill another person, and therefore you would, in a way here, dominate another person, and that characteristic of equality would go away, right? So um, understand that that place is theoretical. So both Hobbes and Locke knew that, again, in order for them to further their story, we would have to leave the state of nature. Okay, we could not stay there. Okay, and they are also borrowing from the idea of the Enlightenment, because what did the Enlightenment give us? This idea that we can think for ourselves. In other words, that we can reason, right? Hint, hint, right? We would leave the state of nature because we would choose for ourselves to leave it because it is not a convenient place. So as a result, hint, hint, everyone, I want you to follow me here. We would leave this fictitious place called the state of nature, Hobbes and Locke would contend, because we have reason and thought to do so, bestowed upon us by the Enlightenment. We would leave the state of nature from its purest form and then come into an organization. Now, again, you have to question this, because remember, they're talking about us. So I want you to ask yourselves, is what they are saying about us really true? Again, fundamentally, they've added another assumption about our human nature, that we would form into groups, into an organization. Well, do you buy that? And in fact, we bought that story, right? In a way, the social sciences, disciplines like anthropology, sociology would say that it is human nature, right, that we would form into groups. The basic nature, basic group would be the family, mother, father, child. Next complex organization would be tribal relationships, and then we get into more complex societal relationships. In a way, these disciplines have reinforced really this assumption that Hobbes and Locke are making, that we would form into an organization. But again, deeply, ladies and gentlemen, I want you guys to really, really think about that. Is that really true? Now, I really don't know the answer to that. Again, it's a philosophical question, but I want you to realize that we have bought into their story. And in a way, that is important, because in order for us to talk about government and our system of government that we have today, you have to buy into their stories. Okay? I mean, we just have to accept it. But again, you should critically think about these theories. Is it really true that what they're saying about us is true? All right, I'll get off my high pedestal there, but think about that. I really want you to ponder that. So in political science, we organize into two forms, okay, two big groups. Civil society, that we'll talk much more about in Unit 3. Civil society are essentially non-governmental organizations, different interest groups that are not affiliated formally with government, okay? If you belong to different clubs, right, the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, or any other interest groups, okay, that's not formally associated with government, that, again, is in the realm or in the sphere of civil society, okay? The other group that we would form is government, Okay, government, right? The rule-making institutions that determines politics that we talked about. So we're going to focus right now, again, on government, right? Because essentially, if you think about it, this is, again, the origins of government here is what Hobbes and Locke are going to talk about. Okay, let's talk about the social contract here. The social contract is, again, this idea that Hobbes and Locke created. But before I define what the social contract is, let's talk about what contracts are. And some of you folks may already know what it is. They are compromises. Okay, they involve what's called in Latin a quid pro quo. It involves a trade-off. You give up something to get something. Now, for those of you who work, okay, at least legitimately here, you would have signed a contract, right? And on that contract, it would have stipulated what services you would provide to your employer, whatever it may be. And then on that contract, your employer also promises to give you, some form of salary, some form of compensation for those services, right? So there is a trade-off. I give you something, okay, and I get something in return, okay? That's a simple way of looking at what a contract is, okay? That is essentially what a contract is. It's a quid pro quo that involves a trade-off. Now that you know what a contract is, let's talk about Hobbes and Locke's social contract. Hobbes and Locke's social contract is a contract between you as an individual and government. Okay? Government, again, is the organization that, again, Hobbes and Locke said that we would form. So what, again, is our trade-off with government? Okay? Now, I want you guys to recognize this, that the only thing that we possess, okay, in theory, okay, you have to accept this to be true. Hobbes and Locke believes that the only thing that we possess in the state of nature that we decided to leave, that we can call our own, okay, this is a little abstract, but follow me here. The only thing that we can call our own is our individual freedom, okay? That is something that, again, we possess, that we control. And so the social contract then, okay, this trade-off that we are going to have with government is that we would give some of our freedom away to government, and government in this case would give us some form of rule and authority, some form of social order. Do you see it? There is essentially what the social contract is, okay? You give some of our freedom to government, and in return, government is going to provide us some form of rule and authority. You see it? That is in fact the social contract. Now at this point, I want you to understand that everything that we've talked about, that Hobbes and Locke did, they agree. They agree in the state of nature. They agree that we would leave the state of nature from its purest form because we've been endowed by the Enlightenment with reason and thought. They would agree that we would form civil society and government. They agree on the concept of the social contract. However, the types of government that we, the people, right, would contract with are going to differ. And this is where Hobbes and Locke here diverge. The types of government that we're going to contract with, according to Hobbes and Locke, are not going to be the same. Fundamentally, why? Because they have differing views of human nature. As you recall, right, Hobbes has a very pessimistic view of us, that we cannot be trusted, right, whereas Locke has a more optimistic view about us, that we are naturally good and altruistic, and you will see this will, in a way, put forward the type of governments that we would contract with. So let's turn our attention to our good friend Thomas Hobbes. And again, he's pictured right there for you. Okay, so let's just go back here a little bit and talk about Hobbes and how he views us, right? Remember, they're telling stories about us. Remember that he believes that there is no such thing as natural law, right? No justice or injustice. In fact, we have no idea what good and evil is. There's no concept of that. And as such, okay, according to Hobbes, the state of nature, hint, 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 would be a state of war, right? We would be driven to conflict by our desire for glory and our fear of death, right? Okay? Again, this idea of social Darwinism here, the survival of the fittest. The only uh, um, purpose for us in the state of nature is to survive. And that's why I love this quote from him in his book called The Leviathan, that the state of nature would be a place, quote, that is solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short. Don't you love that? It's just a great, I think, description of the state of nature, right? It means that you're going to be alone. It's not going to be a nice life. It's going to be nasty. It's going to be brutish, and then your life is going to be short. So if you're walking in Hobbes's state of nature, you're walking with your friend. What are you telling your friend? You're telling your friend, watch your back, Holmes, right? Because again, at any time in Hobbes's state of nature, someone is after you, right? Someone's going to take you out, right? It's not a pleasant place, right? You got to watch your back. Right? You got to watch your back, homie. You got to protect yourselves and your interests. Okay? So if that's the case, what then is the solution for Hobbes, right? If we can't live in the state of nature, we would still contract with a government, but what type of government would we contract with? And Hobbes would say in his perennial work, like I said, the book called Leviathan, which was published in 1651, he basically says that we would choose for ourselves. Remember, we would choose for ourselves because we were endowed by the Enlightenment the ability to reason. That we would choose for ourselves an authoritarian ruler. Now, who does that remind you of? That's right, the king, right? This authoritarian ruler is very, very similar to the king, okay? It's a non-democratic form of government, okay? I want you to understand that Hobbes really champions authoritarian systems of government, okay? Since we can't trust each other, since we all fear each other, Hobbes would say that we would contract with an authoritarian ruler who would keep us all in check. And that the purpose of the authoritarian ruler, or in this case, this type of government, would be to keep us all in order. Okay? To Hobbes, I want you to understand that he views really all of us as a bunch of little children. Now, I'm a parent of a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I remember, if I may share a personal story, when my son was 2 years old, really, really curious, and for those of you who have children, you know this, I was making dinner. He, comes into the kitchen, doesn't listen, of course, and decides to put his hand on the stove. And of course, before him getting burned, I managed to catch his arm and told him, no, right, that's going to burn you. In the same way, this is how Hobbes views all of us, right? We have no concept of what's good for us or what's not good for us. We have no concept of good or evil. We have no concept of what is justice or injustice. So as such, he believes that we would contract with an authoritarian ruler, right? Or a parent who will guide his children, right? To do what is best, for them. Okay. Now I know what you're thinking. There's some holes in Hobbes's argument, and you're right. There are a lot of holes in Hobbes's argument. Okay. If we can't trust each other, why should we trust an authoritarian ruler? Okay. And I'll tell you right now, Hobbes doesn't answer that. Okay. That question. Why would we trust the king? Well, folks, why would Hobbes, in fact, have us contract with an authoritarian ruler in the first place? Uh, this is important because you need to know a little bit of history. Once I tell you the context here, you'll be, nodding you'll be in fact nodding in agreement. Oh, that's why he did it. The reason why Hobbes would have us contract with an authoritarian ruler is that he works for the king. He worked for the King of England. Okay, he was an aristocrat. So the King of England approached Hobbes and said, "I want you to legitimize my rule again." Remember, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment had eroded the legitimacy of the divine rights of kings. Here was Hobbes, who was ordered by the king to use in the Enlightenment to once again legitimize his authority and his rule. But if you think about it, folks, it's a swindle, right? Look what Hobbes is doing. He's using Enlightenment theory, right, to, in a way, convince us to, once again, succumb to the power and authority of the king. And how does he do it? Well, he goes back, go back to the fundamental assumption he says about us, that we are all untrustworthy, lying, conniving bastards. And if you believe that, right, if you believe that assumption that we cannot be trusted, which I'm thinking most of you, when you were thinking about the state of nature, it would be a place of anarchy, right? If you believe that we cannot be trusted, then if you follow Hobbes's line of thinking, he would then say, if we can't trust each other, that we would be willing, right, to contract with an authoritarian ruler. Once again, folks, it's a swindle. So when you think of Hobbes, think of him as a model for dictatorships, right? Think about Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Think of the Castro brothers, right, in Cuba, right? They would address the people as their children, right? Are they going to give power to their children? No. Why? Because they don't trust their children, right? They know what is best, right? That is an example of Hobbes's Leviathan and the type of contract that we would, in a way, freely choose. Okay, now it's important for us now to turn our attention to John Locke. Okay, John Locke's view, opposite, right, from our good friend Thomas Hobbes. He believes that the state of nature, hint hint, is a state of inconvenience. But what does he mean about that? Hobbes would have us kill each other in the state of nature. Locke would say that we would not kill each other because we are endowed, okay, we are endowed with what he calls the law of nature. Okay, think of it this way. This is a code of conduct, a sense of ethics, right? Ultimately, we know, at least according to Locke, he's making the assumption that we know the difference between right versus wrong, good versus evil, okay, justice from injustice, and as such we would not kill each other in the state of nature. So as such, if we're not going to kill each other in the state of nature, what are then we going to do in the state of nature? Well, the answer is absolutely nothing. I tend to imagine all of us staring at each other, right, twiddling our thumbs and playing that staring game until one person blinks. And I'm serious here, because if we're not going to kill each other in the state of nature, then what else is there for us to do? And so as such, the state of nature would be a place of inconvenience, right? Think about that, okay? So if we're not going to kill each other in the state of nature, okay, and we would respect everyone else's right, hint, 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 it's a major term that I just said there, right to live. Locke takes this further, okay, folks, okay? He basically says if we have a moral compass that allows us to know what is right from wrong, good versus evil, justice from injustice, and that we will not kill each other. Hint, 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 hint times 1,000. Pay very close attention here. Okay? He extends this further. We would not only respect the right to live, but we would also respect everyone's not just right to live, but right to liberty and the right to property. You probably have heard that, okay? Your rights to life, liberty, and yes, I know, you probably have heard of pursuit of happiness, okay? But according to Locke, okay, it was the right to property. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote those very words, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, really plagiarized from who? That's right, Mr. Locke here in his concept of natural rights. So when I say natural rights, hint, 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 folks, I'm talking about your rights to life, liberty, and your pursuit to any Apple product that you want, right? The new, most latest Apple product out there, whatever it may be, right? Your right to property. And according to Locke, these rights are bestowed upon us by God. Okay? This is very important, that these natural rights are bestowed upon us by God. And as such, these rights cannot be taken away from us. They are, in other words, God-given rights. In other words, natural rights. Our rights to life, liberty, and our pursuit to happiness, in this case, property. Okay? So, those are rights that cannot be taken away from us. And in the state of nature, in Locke's state of inconvenience, it's also inconvenience because in the state of nature, since there is no government, there is also no property rights, right? Who in the state of nature is going to tell you that you actually own that piece of property or that property belongs to you? No one. Okay? In fact, how do we know, or how do you know that you actually own your property today? For those of you who have cars, how do you know that you own that property? Who tells you that you actually own that property? The simple answer is the government. Ding, 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 right? The government, of course, sends you a pink copy, right? Your pink deed for your car, and says that you own that car. If you own a house, you have the deed, right? The government is the one that enforces property rights. That's the role of government. They're the ones who, fundamental roles of government, they're the ones who, again, ensure that property rights have authority, that you own what you own, okay? And in the state of nature, there's no one to determine that. That's why it's inconvenient, okay? So, as a result, Locke would have us leave the state of nature. Locke would have us leave the state of nature again, right? And his solution could be found in his perennial work entitled The Two Treatises of Government, published in 1690. And this is what he said, that ultimately we would contract, hint, 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 with a limited form of government. Okay? A limited form of government. That the purpose of government, now follow me here, this may be a little circular, some of you folks may get a little lost, but follow me here. The purpose of government in this case would be to enforce natural law. In other words, the purpose of government would be to allow us to maximize our natural rights, right? That government's role would be to maximize our rights to life, to liberty, to our pursuit of property, according to Jefferson, our pursuit to happiness. Okay? That is government's role. Okay? To respect, ultimately, every individual's freedom and everyone's idea to this concept of political equality, right? Okay, that everyone is treated equal by the government. Okay, and ultimately, as I said, government's role would also be to protect your individual right to your own property. Okay, and if you think about this in a weird way, right? Government's role is really to protect us from whom? That's right, ourselves. Okay? To protect us from ourselves. If any of us were to violate anyone else's natural rights, then government can step in, right? Okay. Um, Let me give you an example here, an extreme example, which I'll probably use again in Unit 4. In the Bill of Rights, under the First Amendment, uh, it says we have the freedom, right, to practice our own religion in this country. We know that, okay? However, let me just throw this out. If your religion calls for human sacrifice, can government step in and say, no, you can't do that? Can government, in other words, limit that practice? And of course the answer is yes, absolutely. Because you would be depriving your right to live, right? Depriving that person's right to live. There it is, okay? So government comes in here, right? To protect us really from ourselves. Government's role is to protect and secure our natural rights, to enforce natural law. Okay, so there it is in a nutshell. Okay. So this slide will just summarize everything that I talked about really for the past 20 minutes or so. This is your cheat sheet for the exam, and the summary of Hobbes and Locke. As you can see, they're very important to our understanding of our system of government, or the origins of our system of government. Remember, we talked about the state of nature. This is where they began telling their story, right? The characteristics of the state of nature is that there's no government. Everyone is equal to do what they want to do. Everyone is free to do what they want to do. Remember, it is fictitious, theoretical. For Hobbes, the state of nature would be a state of war, right? We would kill each other. For Locke, it would be a state of inconvenience because we would not kill each other, because we would be endowed with natural law or some form of ethics. We would then leave the state of nature in its purest form because we would have reason and thought to do so. Again, this idea is bestowed upon us by the Enlightenment. We would then form groups, one of which was civil society and the other, of course, was government. And the way that we form government is through the social contract theory, also known as natural law theory, but we're going to use the term social contract theory. Remember, this involves a quid pro quo, a trade-off, and some form of freedom for order. Okay, for Hobbes, he would have us contract with some form of authoritarian ruler, and that the purpose of this authoritarian ruler would be to maintain and keep social order. For Locke, it would be to contract with a limited form of government, okay, and to secure our natural rights, our rights to life, liberty, and property. And if you think about it, which theory ultimately influenced our system of government? And that's right, it's Locke's, folks. Okay, who's more important, Hobbes or Locke? It's actually Locke. This influenced the Declaration of Independence. Okay, let me just go back to Hobbes here for a moment. Okay, folks, and examine the social contract a little bit further. Remember what the social contract theory states, or any contract really, if you think about it. It involves a quid pro quo. I give you something, and I get something in return. Okay, you follow? Remember, Hobbes's contract ultimately says that we have to give all of our freedom to an authoritarian ruler. And remember, the only thing that we have in the state of nature, I made mention of this, is our individual freedom. Okay? So if that's the only thing that we can call our own, and we give everything we possess, really, our individual freedom, to a king, do we really get anything in return? Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. You're getting some law and authority, some social order. But is there really anything that we can call on our own? And the answer is no. And so if you follow that logic, that we don't get anything back, then that contract becomes null and void, right? Because there is no trade-off. under Hobbes's social contract. Right? Think about it. There's nothing we get really in return that we can call our own. Now contrast that with Locke's social contract. Now, is there really a fundamental trade-off? Absolutely. Right? Remember that our natural rights are our God-given rights and cannot be taken away. So we give some of our freedoms to government, but government cannot take away our what? Our rights to life, liberty, our pursuit of happiness, our pursuit to property. Okay? So please understand that there is, okay, fundamentally, theoretically, government cannot strip those rights away from us. That is what makes us a free people, and as such, there is a trade-off, and as such, Locke's social contract works. Do you see it? So, one last thing before I move on to our last concluding slides here, we're almost done, is this very idea then that Locke's theory is the one that influenced our government. Now think about that, you guys, because I would bet most of my classes side with Locke. I'm sorry, I apologize. Would side with Hobbes when we talk about the state of nature. Everyone, in a way, has a more pessimistic view of human nature. But if we rely on Locke's social contract, it makes a fundamental assumption about us. And what is that? That we are naturally good. That we are inherently good. That when push comes to shove, we will do the right thing. And I think that's important for us to understand, that in order for our system of government to work well, in order for our system of government to function appropriately, it trusts us to do what is right. Okay, I think of Spider-Man's quote, right, with great power there's much responsibility. I may have gotten that wrong, but I put in the context of freedom. With a much freedom that is given to us comes great responsibility. And so it's important for us to realize that, again, Locke, who is the political theorist that is the basis of our system of government, has a very optimistic view of human nature, that we are inherent. Okay, I just want to talk briefly about the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I'll talk much more about this in a future lecture. But if you read it, and I'm hoping you perused at least through it, it's not that long, you'll find out it was just a rant, right, by Thomas Jefferson listing down all of King George III's actions, arguing that he'd abused his authority. And if you think about it, Jefferson is using the political theory, the rhetoric that came from John Locke, that ultimately assumes that people have natural rights. Without Locke, he can't make that argument, right? That the king is abusing their rights. And so, as such, as you can see, that fundamentally Locke's idea that we are all endowed with natural rights by God, that these rights cannot be abused, cannot be taken away from us, is in fact the ultimate factor, right, that allowed the 13 English colonies, British colonies at the time, to separate from the mother country. I want you guys to note the key values of American political culture. It's in red down there. I won't have time to review them with you. I can guarantee you it'll appear on the exam, but go ahead and review chapters 9 through 11 respectively, and that should again get you squared away with those terms. And last but not least here, I want to talk about the proper role of American government today. I think in our exercise of politics, when I asked you what politics means to you, all of us have high expectations of government. All of us have an idea of what government should or should not do. All of us have this idea of what fairness means to us. government should do this but not this. All of us have our opinions of the proper role of government. And of course that leads to conflict and dilemmas, right? In a democratic system of government, since people have disagreements of what government should or should not do, again, normative, it's a normative study, it leads to disagreement. What I want to do in this slide is just to contextualize for you what the trade-offs are when we have these disagreements of this debate, the scope of government. And there are three things I just want to outline here for you. Provide order and security, right? Government provides order and security. That is one of the freedoms that we've given away, is for government to provide law enforcement and to protect us. So my question is to you is, what did we give up in order to have government do this for us? Well, we've given up the freedom to take the law into our own hands, right? We've given up, really, and I'm not joking here, although this may be funny to some of you, we've given up the right to be Batman, right? Remember, Batman is a vigilante. He took the law into his own hands. We've given up that right. We've given up that right to the police, to the popo, to keep us safe. I've given up my right to mug anyone, whomever I want, down the stairwell, right? And I've given it to the police. So when government provides some form of order and security, it does infringe upon, again, our freedom. Okay? Equality versus freedom. Same thing here. Okay? Some of you folks may know the policy called affirmative action. For those of you who don't, it was a policy passed back during the LBJ administration to provide equal opportunity for minorities, particularly African Americans at the time. What affirmative action does is it would call for state services to provide, access to certain jobs or government contracts, as well as schools to public elite universities, like the University of California. Affirmative action works by using a racial quota system, whereupon they would, again, accept only X numbers of whites, X numbers of blacks, X numbers of Asians, X numbers of Latinos, so on and so forth. And that is affirmative action. And as you can see, affirmative action is a law that promotes equality. What I want you guys to realize here is that there is this inherent tension, once again, that when government passes laws that would promote equality, it again infringes on people's freedom. Okay? And so in affirmative action, whose freedom is it infringe? Looking at the example of the admissions process, it infringes, again, the admission officer's freedom to choose the best qualified candidate based on merit, right? Because affirmative action forces him or her to accept X numbers of these different racial groups or categories, they may not, in fact, get the best based on merit. So as you can see, there is that trade-off. And last but not least, general welfare as well is there's fundamental trade-offs as well. Depending on how you view climate change, okay, if government decides to, as in here in California, there's legislation that's going through to limit carbon emissions, remove these harmful greenhouse gases, there's always going to be a trade-off, and that trade-off is money, right? Okay, so as you can see, when we discuss the role of government, there will always fundamentally be trade-offs. There's something that we give up, and it is through the political process that we again determine what our priorities are, what we are going to do with these limited resources, who's going to have rights and not. Again, all of these falls under this discussion, this serious discussion, very much so, of our role with government. So I will conclude there, and believe it or not, I will explain research brief number 2, hopefully, to you by next week. So have a great one. We'll see you guys hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks.